Welcome to the Greener Way podcast, a show about people, planet, and purpose, and how investors and corporate leaders push forward in a complex world. John Pabon, thank you so much for joining us on the Greener Way. Would you take a couple of minutes and just introduce yourself to our audience?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, first off. I call myself a pragmatic altruist. I've been in the sustainability space for about 20 years, and I started off at the United Nations. But after I left there, I sort of traveled the world looking at sustainability firsthand. So that's, in factories, on the fields. I spent quite a bit of time living and working, in a palm oil plantation in Borneo, and then also with Fortune 500. So my little piece of the sustainability universe now is working with larger sort of Fortune 500 organizations on their sort of G part of the ESG. So looking at transparency, governance, communications work. And then, I do a bit of writing as well. So I have a book out called Sustainability for the Rest of Us, and I have one all about greenwashing coming up in the new year. And that is all the plugging I'm going to do because I want to talk about greenwashing with you.
Look, plug away. We're here. We're here to be your platform for this, John. It's interesting that you sort of conceptualized this as talking about the governance part of things, because sort of in my head, if I think about ESG sort of visually, the G is sort of the umbrella term with everything else flowing from that, from a corporate perspective. I think sort of fundamentally at a pragmatic level. What does that mean for you if you're talking about governance, transparency, and sustainability? How do you sort of conceptualize that thematic for yourself?
Yeah, so for me, it's always a starting point around materiality, and I know that that might be a divisive issue in the profession, but it's for any client, materiality is where it starts. It helps me understand what's going on in their business, but it definitely helps them focus on what it is they need to focus on. So, and I think a lot of times, in sustainability, companies, particularly as they're starting out, want to do everything, and because of that, they end up doing nothing at all. So having that focus is super important. And then going from there into the stakeholder engagement part of it is obviously the second most critical area of governance. And then from there, how you talk about all of that. So that could be the communications aspect of it, it could be the reporting aspect, or just transparency in general, but really working on those three major elements of governance, which as I talk about it, I guess that's kind of all of governance.
It's interesting, sort of the way in which governance sort of appears as thematic in sustainability. I can remember sort of I've been doing this publication for almost 12 years now, and in the early days, environmental and social issues were sort of a proxy for governance, and now it's almost sort of upended that if you want to have good social and environmental outcomes, you've got to have the governance frameworks and practices in place first.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about that other G word you mentioned before, greenwashing. Certainly, the word came into its own in 2022. I can't imagine that it's going to be less of a concern in 2023. So let's get on to the subject of your book, John, and sort of your work at the moment. How do businesses make sure they're not greenwashing, or perhaps even worse, greenwishing?
I love the green wishing, and there's so many different sort of takes on this. There's blue washing, green washing, green wishing. I love it.
Rainbow washing for the
There's that.
SDGs.
Yes, this is absolutely right. I think the first thing, we sort of have to go back to basics, right? So the very first thing that companies need to do, and even before I start all of that, I'll take a step back and talk about different types of greenwashing, because it's not all created equal. So in terms of segments, and certainly what we've noticed post-COVID, and yes, I know we're still in the middle of the pandemic, but as we're coming out this other end of it, there's been a massive uptick in greenwashing. And I think a lot of that is because companies now have realized, I can jump on the sustainability bandwagon and make a bunch of money off of it. So they've realized they're behind, so they're trying to play catch up. And because of that, I think a lot of times they're accidentally greenwashing because they're trying to do so much. So not giving them a pass, it's just as bad, but that kind of contextualizes things a bit. Then, of course, on the other end of the spectrum, you have the segment that are doing it outright. They're lying. They have it built into their marketing mix, and that's a whole different kettle of fish. So those are kind of the big segments. But even when it comes to what greenwashing is, there's three big types of greenwashing. You have the outright lies, the green speak, but that's even becoming slicker as companies realize consumers aren't so stupid. So they like to throw statistics out that make no sense. They do claims that they know consumers are not going to research or fact check, which is true. So that's sort of the blatant part of greenwashing. Then you get a little slicker when you get into sort of this misdirection. And I like to use the analogy of the Wizard of Oz. So Dorothy and then the folks, they get to Oz, they see these big fireballs and the big head, And then Toto goes over to the curtain and pulls it back and sees this feeble old man sort of, pushing buttons and pulling levers. And that's
Mm-hmm.
what companies are doing. They're misdirecting because they know they're feeble, they know they're not doing the right things, and they're obfuscating from the truth. So
Mm.
misdirecting the public with fancy language. The funniest thing is really around these semiotics. So how they use, that's a fancy marketing term, semiotics.
Oh.
So how they use colors and symbols
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
really convince consumers that they're sustainable. Green
Mm-hmm.
packaging, or you slap a panda bear on something, and all of a sudden people
Mm-hmm.
think, oh, you're great. So that's the second type. And then, of course, there's the sort of the really cashed up companies, particularly in highly polluting industries, that will fund these sort of lobbying groups that appear on the surface to be sustainable or to be NGOs, but in reality they're
Mm-hmm.
just working for the man, so to speak. So those are the
Mm-hmm.
big types. Now,
Mm.
I guess to get back to your question, what can companies do? It goes back to, like we talked about a minute ago, understanding your audience is
Mm.
the most important. Your stakeholders, your audience. So a funny little analogy is this guy Tony Piliceno, and a lot of people might not know his name, but they'll know his TikTok videos because during the
Mm-hmm.
pandemic he would do these paint mixing videos where
Oh
he
God,
would,
yes.
yeah, so he would mix them, and you'd be like, okay, what's the color going to be? And it was really fun. He worked for a company called Sherwin-Williams. As an American, you would
Mm-hmm.
know Sherwin-Williams, a big paint company,
Absolutely.
100 years old. You would figure this is opening up a very unsexy industry into an entirely new segment of younger consumers. But Sherwin
Mm.
Williams said, they fired the guy because he violated the social media policy, and that's just not understanding who your stakeholders are. And we're doing the same thing
Mm-hmm.
in sustainability. We're not listening to the audience. We're not listening to our stakeholders. So it's really, as a first step, getting back to understanding what the internal and external folks want. And as
Mm.
professionals listening to this today, you have your universe of stakeholders that's always expanding. You have your internal folks, you have the external ones that are financing the whole operation, basically, and then that
Mm-hmm.
third ring of those that give you the license to operate. So civil society,
Mm-hmm.
government, understanding everything that they want is so critical. And then going from that, really getting into the material issues and making whatever you're communicating, making it strategic. And I've done quite a
Mm.
bit of work with DocuSign over the past year, and everybody knows DocuSign. We've used DocuSign for years, and
Mm.
what we don't sort of realize, and an aha moment for me was, they're not just a super cool, innovative, tech company that's doing great things in the
Mm.
digital side.
Mm.
Think about all the trees they've saved.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Even as a sustainability professional, I didn't put two and
Yeah.
two together until I was working with
Yeah.
them. I'm like, oh, of course, you've
Yeah.
saved millions of trees. You've,
Mm-hmm.
saved all the carbon footprint, all by just
Mm-hmm.
moving things online. And that's because they thought strategically about the things they were doing. And that's not
Mm-hmm.
just as a way to save the planet. Sure, they did great
Mm.
things by the planet, but
Mm-hmm.
it just makes business sense, right? Because why
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't you move things digitally? And why wouldn't you
Mm-hmm.
think of tech and then make it into sort of tech for
Mm.
good? So a great
Mm-hmm.
example of thinking strategically about
Mm.
what you're doing. And I think once you understand what your stakeholders want, once you have those material issues at hand and what you should be focusing on, it's really about
Mm.
communicating it out in a way that makes sense. And I think one of the
Mm-hmm.
biggest struggles that we have, particularly on the communication side of sustainability, is that companies that are doing the right thing tend not to talk about it because they sort of
Mm-hmm.
feel it's inauthentic. And I think we
Mm-hmm.
need to get those companies that are doing great things, because there's so many of them. We need to get them out there. We need to get them talking about things. We can't make them too nervous that they're going to greenwash,
Mm.
because we need to get the message out so that it sort of builds that virtuous cycle. And I think a good reminder for companies, because by and large companies are very conservative when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
communications, is
Mm-hmm.
that your consumers, your stakeholders, they don't expect you to be perfect.
Mm.
They do expect you to be honest. So,
Mm.
it's
Mm-hmm.
okay to make mistakes, but own up to them and fix them.
Mm.
And that's sort of the way we should look at particularly sustainability comms going forward.
It's been really interesting. I think sort of in the back end of the year, John, there's been a couple of cases where you've had like, Cbus a couple of months ago, and then Vanguard last week, pulling out of collaborative engagement groups are related to the net zero. So the net zero asset owners, net zero asset managers. And I wonder if we're in for a bit of a reckoning, that a bunch of institutions have gone out and made public commitments and joined sort of collaborative groups, and now are reassessing the gulf between what they need to do to achieve that and what they can achieve within the boundaries of their organization. And I wonder a bit about that pullback. Is that pullback healthy, do you think, as organizations sort of reassess what they've, signed up to in public and now have to deliver authentically?
I think it's absolutely healthy because it
Mm,
really brings into reality what it is we're doing. We can write down
mm,
all the commitments we want. We can say we're going to do
mhm,
X, Y, and Z, but if it's not realistic or strategic, then kind of what's the
mhm,
point? We're just deluding ourselves. So I think
mm,
by companies taking a step back and reassessing what they're doing and making more realistic plans, so versus
mhm,
a, carbon neutral by 2050, maybe they're saying, okay, we're going to do 10% by 2030. I would rather see that very strategic, realistic statistic than something that's just a bunch of fluff and ends up greenwashing at the end of the day. So I think it's all a
mm,
great thing. And I think certainly what's happening here in Australia, which is quite interesting, is this confluence of companies realizing, okay, we need to be better about how we're approaching this, not just because, we're at risk of greenwashing, but because it makes business sense. And then
mm,
from the top down, you have the government coming in and saying, we're going to be watching you, we're going to be finding
mhm,
you, we're going to be really making sure that you're doing what it is you say you're doing. And I love that sort of top down, middle up kind of approach to
mm.
sustainability. I spent 10 years of my career in China, which is sort of the command and control economy. And
Yep.
they've been able to make such forward momentum with sustainability because they do have that command and control. So the government says it, you
Mhm,
do it. And
mhm,
that doesn't work in all instances. It doesn't
mm,
work in every country. But I think in instances like getting corporations to move the needle a little bit more,
mhm.
having the government step in and dictate is a move in the right direction. So a lot of praise for what's happening out of Canberra.
Look, we're recording this in the backdrop of Treasurer Jim Chalmers yesterday announcing that there's going to be more standards on climate disclosure going forward, which does feel like a big step forward from the Australian perspective. That there's going to be an element of prescription on what good disclosure looks like, but it's off the back of a lot of global momentum around all sorts of governance and reporting stats, isn't it?
That's right. I mean, the UN and the new standards that are coming out, and this
Mm,
is a topic for a different day because we could talk about it for hours. But the reporting metrics and the benchmarking, all
mm,
this sort of thing, is sort of coming to a head and becoming a lot more streamlined because it's been confusing
mm.
for about a decade, really confusing. So I'm glad to see that's happening, and there's more of a concerted focus on how we're measuring what it is we're doing.
So let's blend that into another part of sort of your practice, and I want to explore with you this concept that you were bringing up in your first book. That the concept of sustainability hasn't had a big enough impact. I don't think that's a particularly controversial statement anymore. I think we all wish we were a little bit further down down the road in terms of recognizing donut economics and sort of planetary boundaries. But can you just explain what you mean when you say that sustainability as a concept hasn't shifted the needle enough, and what needs to happen going forward to get us where we need to be going?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the biggest issue is that we're not marching in lockstep anymore. So if we go back to sort of sustainability 1.0, right? So
Mm,
the 1950s, 1960s, when the proper modern environmental movement started, you had Rachel Carson, and you even
mm,
had folks in the government, which is shocking that have politicians in line with building a sustainable future. But it was true. I
yeah.
mean, Earth Day was founded by a group of American senators, which is
Mm-hmm.
shocking to think
Mm-hmm.
about in today's perspective. And at that time, everybody was moving in lockstep. Everybody had a shared idea of where we were trying to get to. And that obviously helps move the needle. I'm going to use an overused adage of the African proverb, if you want to
Mm,
go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. But it really
mm-hmm.
rings true with this. And
Mm,
as time went by, you have sustainability 2.0, which was kind of the era of the 80s and greed and conglomeration. That really messed us up and put us going in different directions.
mm.
And even within that period, you sort of had the professionalization of NGOs. So a lot of people assume NGOs are doing great. And yes, a lot of them are doing amazing work, but they're corporations just like anything else. So they're held to the needs of stakeholders as well. And then you get into kind of the past 15 years, which is where we've really seen a stronger effort by the private sector to become more sustainable, truly authentically
Mhm,
sustainable. And I think that's where we are now. And we're sort of seeing, as you mentioned before, this reckoning, this changing. We're in this changing
mhm,
period where we know we need to do something more. We know
mhm,
sustainability is no longer fit for purpose because if I ask five people to define it, I'm going to get 100 different
mhm,
answers. So
mhm,
right now it's really about finding, okay, who is going to lead us? Because we have the activists on one end of the scale who are passionate and they're vocal,
mhm,
but not necessarily the most pragmatic or strategic in the things that they're doing. You have the
Mm-hmm.
folks on the other end who maybe like the governments, for example, who have sort of given up by and large. I mean, there's, I think, one country out of 194 that's on track to meet their Paris targets. It's
Mm-hmm.
shocking that this far along governments are still not doing anything because they've
Mm-hmm.
handballed it back to the people. We
Mm-hmm.
don't have as individuals capacity or resources to do
Mm-hmm.
what needs to be done. So I think that in my world at least, it really falls on the private sector to be doing the lion's share of the
Mm-hmm.
work. And I suppose on a positive note, my crystal ball projection would be in 15 or 20 years time, as you're a consumer, you go to the
Mm,
shelf, all choices are going to be sustainable because companies
mm,
that haven't played ball, they're not going to be around much longer.
mm,
So that's in a decade or more's time. So we're just
mm.
in this transition period now, but on a hopeful note, we'll get there eventually.
Yeah, I wonder about that. I obviously, as managing editor of the sustainability of FS Sustainability, my job is I talk about investment and business sustainability, but I sort of wonder if that's not whether or not the pendulum's swinging too far in the direction of financialization and financial metrics of sustainability, where really this is an incredibly broad and interrelated series of concepts. The just transition or an equitable transition. Um, you know, should we be relying on a tech solution to climate change that doesn't take into account human rights, things like that? So, how do you foresee this? Is this sort of going to be a series of pendulum shifts back and forth as we oscillate for the next 15 years, or is there a way to bring these stakeholders together where we're creating a common umbrella series of terms for sustainability that doesn't sort of swing towards one stakeholder group to the other?
I think it's probably going to be less of pendulum shifts over time and probably more of kind of a
Mm,
slingshot where it'll happen, it'll sort of click all of a sudden and things will
mm-hmm.
fall into place. And I don't know if that's being too hopeful. Like I said, I call myself a pragmatic altruist, so hopefully I'm not being too altruistic with that notion. But I sort of
Mm,
seeing it happen now. If you just look back to COP in Egypt, the past
mm,
conference, it's
mm.
the blowback from that because you had what people are calling sustainability. What are they calling them? Narcissists. So all the influencers that showed up there because sustainability is now the sexy thing to do, which I guess is it's what we wanted, but not in the way that it materialized. So we're getting there, but there's an eye on it now. People are watching it. It's no longer an issue of getting people to pay attention. Now it's an
Mm-hmm.
issue of everybody's paying attention. What do we do with that platform?
Mm,
So I think
mm-hmm.
that nexus point is it's happening now. You have the financial
Mm-hmm.
community, the investor community coming in to say, hey, we'll give you lots of money if you do X, Y, and Z, because for us, we need to make sure our portfolios are sound. That's great. And I hope that doesn't go too far in the wrong direction, like you were sort of alluding
Mm-hmm.
to. You have corporations as well coming in and saying, okay, we need to do better with what we're doing. Governments, too, are starting to realize, okay, we need to be putting a bit more of our thumb on the scales here. So all of
Mm,
that in my mind, and consumers, of course, that
mm,
underlies everything. The consumers are demanding more of companies and what they're standing for. So I think
mm,
all of that is reaching again this nexus point that we're going to see a slingshot into something different. When that happens, I don't know,
mm.
but I do see it sort of moving that direction.
From my perspective, you're a pragmatic altruist. I always think, in the absence of sure knowledge about the future, choose hope over despair. We'll meet somewhere in the middle.
That's it. That's exactly it.
So looking forward, then, John, what are the biggest impacts, tipping points, catalysts that you can foresee that will challenge or provide opportunity for all of these stakeholders going forward in this area of building a more sustainable economy?
It's an interesting question. I think we probably touched on a few of those a bit already. I think
Mm,
consumers are going to be quite an inflection point, and whether or not these external factors like financial crises or just being able to heat your home at night, which is sort of
mm-hmm,
important,
mm-hmm,
those things, if they don't sort of distract us from moving the direction that we've already been moving in toward a sustainable future. We already see lots of statistics around consumers wanting companies to be ethical, companies to stand for something, and to be willing to pay a bit more for organic or sustainable products. So we're seeing that happening. I hope that continues to move in a positive direction. I
mm-hmm,
think as well, this is both a barrier but a potential opportunity are international organizations like the United Nations, my old my old boss, that they do need to take a long hard look at what they're doing, and if their approaches are still fit for purpose. I don't believe they are. I don't think
Mm,
many people would argue with me about that.
mm,
So how do we change that? How do they change that to be a little bit more sustainable and fit for purpose? And also, again, how we use this massive platform that we now have that we've never had before, of corporations, media, governments, individuals, all wanting to know what's next and wanting to support what's next. How do we use that platform, and how do we corral all of these resources to go in the right direction? As we talked about a second ago, we're at this point now where it can go one of two ways. We can corral this platform to go the right
mhm,
way, or we can let it run amok. If
mhm.
COP27 is any indication, we're not going the right way, but it's still early on, so we can push it in the right direction.
100%. All right. Well, let's leave it on that note of hopefulness. John Pabon, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Greener Way podcast. If you liked today's show, remember to rate and review us on your podcast platform and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss an episode. Any feedback? Contact us on podcast@fssustainability.com.au. I'm Rachel Allen Backus.
The Greener Way podcast is a product of FS Sustainability, a show about people, the planet, and investing in our collective future. All information in this podcast is for education and entertainment purposes only. The Greener Way podcast gives listeners access to information and educational content provided by discussing numerous financial sustainable options and our featured guests. It is not intended as a substitute for professional, legal, or tax advice. The hosts of The Greener Way are not financial professionals and are not aware of your personal financial circumstances. FS Sustainability operates under an Australian Financial Service License and the exemption made available under the Corporations Act 2001 in respect to any information or advice given. Before making any financial decisions, you should read the product disclosure statement and, if necessary, consult a licensed financial professional. For more information, head to the disclaimer page on the FS Sustainability website, fssustainability.com.au.